Hello, everyone. This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome a former guest and present guest, Fron Nahzi, who is an Albanian expert, a consultant, and on freedom and democracy. So he's been working on these things for many years, and we first met at the time of the Balkan Wars when Fron was particularly interested, of course, in Kosovo and the events in Albania. And one of the problems with this area is it produces more history than they could consume locally. So what Fran's emphasis in his new book is that essentially some of those politics were consumed in the United States. There's his book about interest groups in the US and the Albanian diaspora here and their effect on events, which was actually more significant than might now appear. One of the problems, of course, is not many people, as the Kosovo foreign minister in exile told me once, that nobody knows, none of the people in Washington knew, 99% didn't know where Albania was. Only 1% of those knew where Kosovo was. And I just asked her whether they spoke Gego Tusk there. So they said, well, you must be CIA. Nobody knows this. This was inner secrets. For reasons I won't go into, I've always been interested in Albania. I actually have on my shelves, apart from our works and the famous novelist Ismail Kadara, I've also got Enver Hoxha's collected works I discovered when I opened a box the other day. So, in English, I might add. So, from you, first of all, who are the Albanians in America and how long have they been here? You cover this in the book. Perhaps you can give a rundown on it.
Well, Ian, thanks once again, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just backtrack. So, how I got in, how the book started. So, I was teaching at the American University. I was teaching public policy for administration, and during the course of that, we talked about the impact that ethnic groups have on U.S. foreign policy. And quite often, we always mention the Cuban Americans, we mentioned the Jewish community in the United States regarding Israel, or the Irish regarding Northern Ireland. And I was telling them a particular story about how the Albanian American community in in 1999 found themselves sitting with Bill Clinton talking about the NATO bombing. It was a 5-minute meeting, but I just thought, and I told him more in jest than saying that. It's incredible how sometimes these ethnic groups find themselves, in these interesting situations. But then I decided to take that step further since I was involved in a lot of these movements from early on and asked a very simple question: to what extent did the Albanian American community like the really influence U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Albania and obviously Kosovo? And since I was involved again in the Kosovo and Albania issue early on, I wanted to go back and look at the movements. And the movements actually are divided into three really distinct movements, which are tied to the immigration community from Albania and Kosovo. So the first one is between 1850 and 1940, which were the Albanians from Albania, most of them from the South. They came to the United States. Most of them were in Boston area. And it's during this particular period in the early 1900s it's about nation in the sense it's a nationalist movement in the sense of identification of the Albanian state. So I track some of the intellectuals who come here because they're forced out of Eastern Europe, in particular from Romania, Vienna, and elsewhere, and they find a safe haven here in the US during the early 1900s. And luckily, they go to Massachusetts and link themselves with the Protestant movement. At that time, the Second Proclamation of the Protestants was taking place. There were a few Albanians who had converted to Protestant, who became Protestants, and the Protestant missionaries helped the first early Albanian immigrants provide them a platform where they can voice their opinion and bring Albania to the forefront of decision makers. And as most of us know from history also, that they also had a backdoor channel to Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a big proponent of this movement where we should keep, let me be politically correct for 1 second, United States white. And in that particular reason, that white at that time was associated with religion. meaning that anything that was Protestant was white, as we know, anything else that was non-Protestant was considered, unfortunately, not part of
And
the.
the Italians not so white.
It's exactly so they actually break it down, and ironically, one of the reasons why the Protestants take this on is because part of the mission at that time was to convert the Ottoman Empire to Christianity. Part of it was Armenia, and they decided to adopt Albania as also as another strategic point. And they invest hundreds of thousands of dollars there in opening up schools and also helping the Albanians into what we would call today the Greater Albania, which would include Kosovo and the southern part of Albania and the northern part of Greece. And this link actually helps them tremendously, the early immigrants. And there's about 8 or 10 of them, and they establish newspapers. But the challenge for them is to educate the Albanian community on what is an Albanian. Since there was no nation state, there really was no such thing as an Albanian per se. In fact, in 1910, an Albanian goes to Albania and he takes a survey of 100 people and asks them, how many of you are Albanian? Only 5 respond that they're Albanian. They actually, most of them identified by their religion. Either if you're a Muslim, you're a Turk. If you're an Orthodox, you're a Greek. And if you're Catholic, you're Latin, meaning that you were associated
But
with
that was
Rome.
typical for the region. I mean, there are Turkish Christians who are counted as Greek because they're Christian,
Right.
even
So,
though they
so
speak Turkish, and there are, vice conversely, there are Greek Muslims who are counted as Turk because they're Muslim.
So this first group, when it came here, really came for economic purposes, and then later on they take on much more of a political path. And what's interesting about them, and we'll see in the next 2 stages, is that they realize that America becomes the unconditional player that they need in order for the recognition of the Albanian state. And their entire argument, which is the same argument the Albanians will use throughout the course of history, is the moral argument of why Albania should exist. It didn't really have a very good argument as far as vested interest was concerned. It also had very, very powerful neighbors that wanted to tear apart. And as we all know, the very famous speech by Woodrow Wilson, a 14-point speech, he mentions the word self-determination, which he never really defines, but we'll skip that for 1 second. And the Albanians cling on to that, along with the Protestants, the Axis, and try to hold the U.S. government accountable to this moral obligation to help groups like the
That was a
Albanians.
very eventful speech because it had repercussions right across the globe, and the Palestinians, the Arabs immediately picked up on it.
Right.
The Indians in the subcontinent picked up on it, and he, of course, he
Well,
did. He meant white Protestants have self-determination. Everyone else is.
well, right. So Woodrow Wilson gives a speech, and we have to remember that his own advisors are saying, this is crazy. You can't do that because obviously the Native Americans are also going to demand their own state. So they tell behind the scenes to Europeans, don't worry about that. But the Albanian diaspora at that time, the group, are very smart to capture that. And then the Western press also begins to actually take an interest in writing more stories about this particular group. Now, what's key here is, again, is really the Protestants who explain to the general public that although the Albanians lived on the Ottoman rule, they are really Western Europeans. And the Albanian diaspora at that time also spends a tremendous amount of time in publishing new articles and new books, proving their link to Western Europe, from the various popes to the various leaders. But the most important part here is that the American Protestant movement says the Albanians are ready to convert, not into Roman Catholics, but into becoming Protestants. And they can become the important link for the American movement, in the sense of, at that time, I hate to be so blunt about it, but convert the whole world into this sort of likeness of this of the Christian state. And the Albanians play upon this very nicely. The one interesting thing about this is that the Albanians during that time also create various groups throughout the United States, and who actually sent telegrams to Woodrow Wilson, and also during the during the Versailles peace conference, supporting the state of Albania. Kosovo was secondary to what we call Chamria or Ipiru for the Greeks. And out of sheer luck, and this is one of the other themes that comes up in each one of the movements. One is the moral argument the Albanians make, and quite often it's really quite luck that the Albanians did in the end up with a state, is that Italy became too aggressive and wanted both the uh, ports in the northern part of the Adriatic and also have parts of Albania, losing Albania itself in the process, and quite often meaning the Europeans come around to it and recognize the Albanian state but we'll skip all the other reasons. So the Albanians do, in short, for the first part, sets the platform that the next generation of Albanians immigrants come in. So the second was the anti-communist movement, which is from 1945 to about 1970s. And that's my family. We came here through what they call the free committees at that time that were formed by the U.S.
Perhaps we
government.
should explain, because we can't take it for granted that listeners will know, is that Enver Hoxha and the Albanian Party of Labour, the communists, were prominent in throwing off occupation, or at least taking advantage of the end of Italian and German occupation. And
Right.
so from 45 onwards, Albania was a very loyal Stalinist state.
And this is kind of interesting because at that period, as we know, the goal was to actually bring down communism, and and fascist movement. And you're right, the Communist Party of Hoxha takes over very quickly, and the thought was that they will align themselves with probably Great Britain and the United States, but rapidly they become part of that Moscow orbit. Um, Once that happens, there is an attempt by the United States, as everyone knows about the Kim Philby affair, which is to overthrow the regime in the 50s, which completely collapses by using the parties and exiles, not only in a sense for military purposes, but also for propaganda purposes. That Keenan then writes his very famous memo, says, look, it's a containment policy we should have rather than actually trying to physically overthrow these
We should
governments.
once again explain, not everybody, I know about this, but and you do, but Kim Philby was a famous public schoolboy spy in Britain was working for the Soviets for many, many years until he defected. And he was in charge of both sending the would-be guerrillas from Albania in there, and at the same time telling the Albanians where they were going to land to pick them up.
Right. So Philby is part of that whole Cambridge Five that came out, which is, I think, a number of books and movies came out. But when you look at the documents a little closer, it wasn't only Philby that actually was responsible for the failure of that mission. It was actually really poorly planned. There was also miscommunication by what the diaspora community was presenting to the Americans and the British and versus reality. For
An
example,
idiotic bay of pigs, you could say.
exactly. But during that time, for about 5 years, the US government and Great Britain were dropping approximately 500,000 leaflets per month that's saying that freedom is coming. And yet, interesting enough, Ian, until this day, no one's ever seen one of those leaflets.
Toilet
In the,
paper.
in the, in the book, I include copies of them, but in Albania itself, no one. And so I just skip a little bit. And you have King Elect who tries the same thing in the mid 80s, trying to send leaflets with balloons, but the balloons are swiped off from Italy, the Italian coast, and sent to Greece and never really reach Albania. So you have all these weird kind of attempts. And the most important part about the 1945, 1970s is the following. One is the American government forms what they call the free committees. And you had it for Poland, Hungary, and the idea was that they would use a diaspora community in the United States through Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and other channels in order to counter the Soviet propaganda. But at the same time, these free committees play an important role by maintaining the identity of each group. So in the particular case for the Albanians, the Albanian Free Committee not only is responsible, along with Catholic Charities and the World Council of Churches, for literally helping more than 10,000 families immigrate to the US. For your record, 90% of them were Muslim. These were Catholic and World Council of Churches bringing these people over to the
And there
United
was no
States.
ice waiting for them.
There was no IS, there was nobody here, and it was literally done by the vetting was done by the Free Committee, and Catholic Charities and the World Council of Churches provided a small little loan, travel loan of approximately $500 for each family to travel to the United States. And during this process, even though they don't have much of an impact on Albania itself, they do manage to actually maintain the identity of the Albanian community through newspapers, radios, and so forth. And then my last one, and then I'll stop here, is we would call the 1980s to current, which is the Kosovo movement. And here again, you have most of the people that came from Kosovo during this time came for economic reasons to the United States. They were not political. The political people went to Switzerland and Germany. As movements begin here, in particular, we have to give credit to one congressman, Joe Diogati, who taps into, he's a representative from Westchester, a Republican, realizes he has Albanian roots, and takes upon the cause of the Kosovo in Congress. And Albanians realize that if you donate money to congressional leaders, they're willing to at least mention the Kosovo issue. And they do so very strategically. There was never a lobbying effort, contrary to popular belief. The Albanians never sought to change a certain law or a certain policy. It was more of an advocacy, once again, trying to get the U.S. government to become morally responsible to the human rights violations taking place in Kosovo.
Which was easier under Clinton when people at least paid lip service to
Well,
civil
that's an
rights and
interesting thing. So,
humanity.
so, so there is one little story in the book. Senator Bob Dole from Kansas in 1998 visits Kosovo, and he comes back to report to President Clinton about what's going on and the fact that war is really coming, and to brief President Clinton. And President Clinton is sitting there, and he listens to Senator Dole the whole time. And after Senator Dole is done, his only thing on his mind is his impeachment, and says, "Bob, can you help me with my impeachment?" Clinton really doesn't take much interest in the Kosovo issue until February, when finally impeachment process is done. The other really key part here is that you find from all the documents is that the independence was never proposed by the US government. Even during the bombing, the NATO bombing, when NATO was bombing Belgrade, you had backdoor channels from Holbrooke to Chris Hill to others trying to get Milosevic to come to an agreement whereby Kosovo will remain part of what was left of
But
Yugoslavia.
autonomous, that's the way it had been in the
It's
past
exactly.
before Milosevic
It was
dissolved it.
never planned to become independent.
Yeah, I actually met both Rugova being brought over by back channel State Department people on a tour, on various tours of the United States, because they're obviously keeping their lines open. And I met DiGardio as well, who was very active, I have to say. My last meeting with him was in a Washington hotel the night before the inauguration of George W. Bush.
Right.
So he was there. He was there.
So the Albanian Americans are very smart because they begin to understand how to organize, and what they do very intelligent. They give to every single candidate, irrespective, Republican or Democrat, as long as they're willing to take on the issue of Kosovo. The key person, again, really who takes over the entire movement inside Congress would be Elliot Engel from New York, who has a large Albanian constituency in the Bronx. He becomes literally sort of the flag bearer of the Kosovo movement. But again, he's very careful not to promise too much and stays within the State Department realm of Kosovo maintaining its autonomy status. As you know very well, everyone agreed that human rights violations taking place, but no one's willing to actually take that step further. And one of the main reasons for that, again, Ian, is that because U.S. foreign policy in the Balkans was formed after World War II, and it was really just based on Belgrade and Athens. And that's all the United States was interested in, is maintaining, obviously, Soviet influence, but at the same time making sure that, that Athens, particularly Greece and the NATO ally and so forth, still dominated that region. The Albanians are never a factor in this.
Well, Albania was included, I suppose, in James Baker's famous dictum that we don't have a dog in this fight.
Exactly. Kosovo, he was talking about Kosovo at that time. Uh, the reason, which one of the documents that you find there is that this, is very interesting as to what extent this close relationship between Ibrahim Rugova, the president of Kosovo, with Chris Hill. And I say that because even though I interviewed State Department officials, they all admit that Chris Hill was trying to undermine the Albanian movement at all times. It took much more of a pro-Belgrade position. And yet Agova remained very close to him and made sure that Chris Hill was always at every single meeting in Washington and elsewhere. And the turning point in where Chris Hill loses his influence along with Holbrooke to Albright really comes when the Racek, the murders that take place in January of 1999, where a number of civilians were killed. And it's that moment where suddenly you have this, the Holbrooke Chris Hill trying to find negotiations with Milosevic versus Albright, who had a much more militant approach to Milosevic, where she actually becomes the key player and says there is no other alternative. We have to take military action because, as we know very well, Bill Clinton said, "I don't want another ethnic cleansing on my hands. I already, messed up Bosnia. I was Ethiopia at that time, so suddenly now I also have
Well,
Kosovo."
for once, the Europeans were taking the lead on this, and Clinton was worried about being outflanked on the
Well,
human rights front, wasn't he?
Well, from the Albanian perspective, and even from the leadership of in Pristina, they had much more trust in the Americans than they did in Europeans.
Oh, understandable. But as it turned out, it was Clinton was dragged in like, almost against his will because he was worried about the Republicans accusing him of getting into foreign wars, as the current president does, accuse the Democrats.
Like I said, again, it's by pure. I remember in '98. I mean, when I was at that time quite active, and we met with State Department officials, and they had sort of this debrief about why should the United States enter Kosovo based on what policy and and it really wasn't much of an argument considering there were Rwanda, you had other places that it never intervened. And again, with the Kosovo issue, and if we're really honest about it, it's that one is the rise of the Kosovo Liberation Army, two is the massacre, by the Serbs, by Belgrade. The third is literally Belgrade just refusing to even give in to any kind of demands that the West had regarding Kosovo. The Rambouillet Agreement, which people seem to forget, if Belgrade had signed that agreement, Kosovo today would be still part of former Yugoslavia.
Yes.
The reason why he declined it is because it also asked that there be foreign troops inside Yugoslavia to keep the peace. And that's something that he didn't want. And it was at every single turn, it really was a lot. It was luck on the Kosovo side, but it was also the failure of Belgrade to realize and to take advantage of a situation they had. And I don't think, in part, it's because I don't think they really, really had any respect for the Albanians. They couldn't believe that the world would actually take a position that they did regarding the Albanians.
So, what's the state of the lobby now? Because, I mean, in terms of Albanians, you have Albania, capital Tirana, and Kosovo, capital Pristina, plus the various enclaves in Macedonia and Greece. All seem to be moving in different directions as far as lobbying and influence groups are concerned.
Yeah, well, the thing is, again, the diaspora community comes together when it's just more of a nationalistic issue, democracy versus communism, or independence versus autonomy, or whatever it was, or at the moment, what you do have small little groups have been formed and continue to do so, but there isn't that kind of relationship or reliance that Pristina Tirana has in the diaspora community. Partially, they also have their own lobby groups. In the case of Pristina, there's not much of an interest really to have much influence on U.S. foreign policy, which I don't understand why. In the case of Tirana, Edi Rama, the prime minister, has shown that he's extremely savvy by understanding the transactional policies of of President Trump by offering the island of Sazan, this former military island, to Trump's son-in-law Kushner for development. As far as the other communities are concerned in Macedonia or Montenegro, there really isn't much. There is a group that represents some of their interests, but not to the extent that we saw in the late 80s, early 90s. The one thing that we must bear in mind is that 2 years ago, there was at one point where Albanians had literally four prime ministers in the region, for Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, and Montenegro, Northern Macedonia, excuse me. So the Albanians have actually come a long way from way back in the 1850s to where they're now. But as far as the diaspora community, the best role they can play for both Kosovo and Albania or the region for the Albanians is literally access to Congress. The documents that I looked at in the archive, they don't have much impact at the State Department level. Not to be too critical one way or the other, I think they did an amazing job for pushing these things, but you've never found any policy paper from the Albanian American side about saying why they should support this cause versus another. You don't really have a strategy per se about, so with that in mind, there is one particular story that everybody seems to be shocked is in 1986, the US government, in order to punish Belgrade for its ties to Libya and for providing a safe haven for terrorists, comes up with a plan to help Kosovo become a republic. And they develop a master plan, which is available in the book and also in the archives there, about how they can use the Albanian diaspora community to help lobby Congress and the State Department for the recognition of the Kosovo Republic. The reason why this is really important is because in 1986, with the exception of the groups in Switzerland or Germany, no other person in the United States was at that time talking about Kosovo Republic or independence. They were talking more about human rights issues. So these kind of strategies, you lack this kind of insight about knowing how to grapple a certain kind of US foreign policy and how you can become the player. And according to that document, one of the reasons why they wanted to give Kosovo Republic was obviously to punish Belgrade for its ties to Libya, but also to win some favorable points with the Muslim countries for saying, look, we're helping a predominantly Muslim area in Europe.
The European, which is what we want, and Muslim, which
Yeah,
is what you want.
exactly. Exactly.
It's a two-for-one deal. No, I did sort of observe that, but you also had a few prominent supporters like Bianca Jagger at the time of Kosovo, who lent some celebrity status
Well,
and put it in.
yeah, I remember that very well. I still don't know why she's so famous, other than the fact that she married, But no,
Well,
I mean,
she's
look,
quite good looking, and she married Mick Jagger. I mean,
exactly
okay,
right. So that's good.
and
No,
she's been very outspoken on human rights issues all
I
around.
think so
So
too.
it's
But I think the other person that needs a lot more credit in this whole game is Morta Bromowitz. And in the book, I really found enough archive documents. More was the go between the Albanians and the State Department. And he had access to Albright Group. He had access to also Clinton. In fact, he was proposed at one time to become the ambassador to Israel. He turned it down supposedly. But even Morta Bromwitz, a seasoned diplomat, becomes the go-between. And the other
he was also,
person,
I mean, he was involved in the broader human rights issues. He was very strong on Bosnia and
absolutely, and
well.
and the
So
other and the other groups where you have the Balkan Initiative Group, which was these were funded the International Crisis Group. A lot of these initiatives were being funded by the George Soros Foundation at that time, and they played a really, really key role in helping with the message to Congress and the State Department. Again, I want to say this, make this very clear. The independence regarding Kosovo was never on the table, and it was never the message that any of these groups pushed either to Congress or to the State Department. Let's say these foreign groups. What they do is they help the Albanians also with the messaging part. So the Albanian Americans rely a lot on the ICG and other studies, Human Rights Watch, and amplify those studies to make the case for Kosovo.
so it was also, I mean, Rugova was an interesting figure. He, he was Kosovo's Gandhi or Nelson Mandela for a long time. But, um, even though he was sometimes, I think, mistaken. But I argued with him about that Kosovars should take up their seats in the Serbian parliament. And, I pointed him to the example of Ireland and the independence movement there, where Sinn Féin took their seats in parliament and created havoc until they got what they wanted. Well,
Right.
partly. But I mean, that's a separate issue. He was, genuinely self-effacing and not
Well,
self-aggrandizing person.
so again, what I say clear from, I know that you know these people, I know these people. I say clear from actually providing sort of about as far as their personalities are concerned. So, for example, Rugova in May 1998, there's a meeting that takes place in the White House where Rugova requests a meeting, and Chris Hill had actually established a relationship between Milosevic and Rugova, where they were discussing a final solution to Kosovo, where Kosovo remained part of autonomy, and Rugova would be president, and blah blah blah. And I'll skip a lot. And there's a meeting in the White House, and I was able to, through the freedom of information law, I finally was able to get the transcript of that meeting, and the meeting was really a photo opportunity for Rugova once he signed off on the Kosovo autonomy status. And he needed that in order to defend himself from the rebels at that time, what he called the Kosovo Liberation Army, and also to win the approval of the general public, saying that the Americans are behind it. And there's others there at that meeting as well. The reason why they don't sign it is because by that time the Kosovo Liberation Army is becoming more powerful, and they warned the Albanians, if you sign, don't come back. And obviously they never signed. So it was kind of interesting to go over today, and rightfully so, should be remembered as a person who played a key role in the independence of Kosovo. But during the process, if you look at behind the scenes, and especially his negotiations with the United States, he knew perfectly well he was never going to get that independence from them. Why? Because the U.S. made it crystal clear every single time. We support your pacifist movement, but not your political position as an independence. And what's great about this story is that the persistence to keep on pushing and pushing. And it just proves that sometimes there is a bit of luck that comes in and it pays off in a sense of independence.
Serendipity and
Yes.
geopolitics. It's there's a thesis for you there. Be a snappier title. So
Thank you.
this is about time to hold up your book, I think, and show us what.
Was that, oh, yeah,
It's not the snappy title. It's like my book on George Orwell, which
it's a little bit too much of a,
the
yeah.
publishers
Anyways,
mutated out of recognition. Uh, it was on Orwell, and I wanted to call it Dispatches from Airstrip One, and they said George Orwell, British and American perspectives. But if when they're charging that much money for it, snappy titles don't sell on the
I
newsstands, do they?
Yeah, no, I honestly look, as I said, the book really, I pulled a lot of, it's also based on first person interviews. It's also based on a lot of his U.S. archives. A lot of it is based on also archives that other people shared with me. And it's an Albanian American who's been involved in this. It's an amazing story. And for me, I think the greatest story there is about maintaining identity, either as an Albanian from Albania or Albanian from Kosovo. And again, I think it reminds us of how things used to be. And in particular, when you look at the fact that you had a pseudo NGO called the Free Albanian Committee, along with Catholic Charities and the World Council of Churches, bringing over 10,000 families and no questions asked. The vetting was done by a local organization. He said, don't worry about this guy.
Times have changed. Times have
It
changed.
has, and just reminds you of sometimes, and some great things came out of it. Some of the most wealthiest Albanian Americans today, United States, and part of that group. Um, I think this has still a lot to do. I think the future, as far as that's concerned, as far as the Albanian American community, is really once Pristina and Tirana understand their role as influence Congress, not so much State Department. I think once that sort of relationship is built, and they understand each other's roles, I think that they'll be able to play a greater role. That said, the official number of Albanians in the United States, and this is again, and I disagree with the actual number, but it's 250,000. I think the number is greater, and the reason why the number is so low is because a lot of the Albanians who came here with Yugoslav passports or Montenegrin passports and so forth. So, and I think there's a process now by the Albanian community to try to get a much more accurate number on that.
Well, one thing we can be sure of is that the situation in Kosovo is still not resolved. It could still be a flashpoint with the Serbs and Mitrovica and the other areas. I mean, this is the
Well,
place that gave us Sarajevo. This is the region that gave us Sarajevo in the First World War. So we should be aware of all of these fuses left lying around fizzing.
Well, yeah, here's my take on that, and I'm going to get in trouble for this. I actually believe, even though I'm a little weary about Gerard Kushner's investments in Albania and Belgrade, I also believe it offers a certain kind of protection from the Americans saying that's huge investments there. And it's that we're
Yes,
not
it's
going to,
shrewd. It's shrewd.
and the US has done that in the past. And in fact, the reason why our United States government recognizes Albania in 1922 is because they found oil off the
Yeah.
coast of
Yes.
Albania. And it's the Sinclair Oil
It's
Company that
our oil,
writes.
the president would have said at some point.
It's exactly. And the Sinclair Oil Company writes a letter and says to the US government, recognize Albania so we could bid for this concession. And they do.
Yeah.
And United States recognizes Albania not because of any moral obligation, but because of literally a transactional policy.
So the book should be read because it might look it's an esoteric branch of Balkan history, but in fact, it's directly relevant to how American foreign policy is made now, with checkbooks rather than the theses
Yeah.
and manifestos. Look, Fran, it's been great talking to you again. Thanks very much, and thank you, members of the Foreign Press Association and everyone else listening. And I hope you will get your library to buy Fran's book, at
Yeah.
least.
Yes.
Is
Thank
the
you.
leather-bound souvenir edition?
No, no. It's cheaper to buy me a coffee if you're really interested. So
Okay, we'll see what we can do about that.
very
But
good.
thanks very much, Fran, and let's
Thank
catch
you,
up
Ian.
soon.
Thank you very much. I
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
everybody. This has been the latest in our series of Outside In, the FPA podcasts. We have more coming on Taiwan. We're doing a grand tour of the flashpoints of the world. So I'm putting some perspective in them. Thanks, Fran. Thank you,
Ian,
everybody.
thank you so much, Ian. I appreciate it.